coming together. The first person I'd like to bring on stage is a woman who is absolutely critical to the success of this program, pulled together all the conference calls, did so much of the work, delivered palm cards for us to hand out, pulled together so many of us. Please join me in welcoming a woman who's a clinical psychologist and educator. All of us know her as one of the fiercest voices to end mass incarceration, working with the International and Concerned Family and Friends of Mumia. Please help me welcome Dr. Suzanne Ross. Next person I'm going to bring up, I've known a mighty long time. We met in prisons. And it's been, he went to a prison, went to another one, came back, we met each other again. That's unfortunately how this system works. This brother has raised the question of the collateral consequences of incarceration to a new level, challenging felony disenfranchisement, opening up that question not just in New York State, where he was incarcerated, but nationally on panels. We've worked together about this, facing his own charges now. Stop for having a pocket knife. Stop for having a pocket knife.
Lord.
That's the kind of nonsense we're dealing with. One of the finest legal minds this nation has to offer. Please join me in welcoming my brother, Joseph Jazz Hayden. Also, one of the founders of Campaign to Free the New Brim Crow.
He's such a good brother.
He is a good guy. He is a good guy.
He's some of the best folk in the movement.
I know.
Now, we are a fired-up crew, and we are a hard-working crew of people, those of us who are working to end mass incarceration. But every now and then, it doesn't hurt to get a little shot of vitamin B12 in the arm. For us, that shot came about 2 years ago with a little book by a woman named Michelle Alexander.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
New Jim Crow. A mother who sparked a movement.
Yes.
And you've already seen him tonight. The work that he does is not only about teaching at Columbia. Maybe you've seen him on television as a commentator. He just did something together on HuffPost Live, doing a shadow convention of the Democratic and Republican conventions. But this is a man who truly puts his wisdom on the line. Worked, I can't even tell you how hard, to pull together a book across steel, concrete, and obviously bad fiber optics. To pull together a book that people have been reading so you really know what it is from Mumia's mouth himself. So Marc, the author of The Classroom in the Cell, and has a new book coming soon, but I won't tell you about that yet. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Marc Lamont Hill.
We love him even though he's from Philly and thinks Philly can compete with Brooklyn.
There's a lot of Philly people in here.
A lot of Brooklyn. Can I answer Brooklyn? Is it Brooklyn?
Philly got John Coltrane now.
Yeah, you always got to go there a little bit. They don't want that, don't have me MC. Okay, so it's hard to quite know how to introduce somebody who's written 20 books and who is more than that. Here's what matters to us. Our on-the-road preacher against poverty, while everybody else is just talking about the middle class. He's saying, what about the poor folks? Ain't got enough money to buy their way into a class. Talk about them. Feed somebody. There's one man who's been doing that and doing it consistently, the steady drumbeat for truth, a steady drumbeat for justice, a steady drumbeat for equity. That's Dr. Cornell West. Bring that brother up here.
I love it, man.
And finally, never least, a woman who has stood facing down their own demons of death on death row.
Yes.
Who has been a voice for the voiceless. a teacher, a master teacher extraordinaire in big, wide classrooms like this and one-on-one with young women who were coming up and trying to do something better. Please join me in welcoming the one, the true, the consistent.
Yes.
The consistent. Yes. Dr. Angela Y. Davis.
Yeah! 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 Sister Angela! Angela! Yeah! Yeah! Lord, Lord. That's consistency, brother.
It's so exciting to have these 5 amazing people up here that I almost forgot they were about to have a panel. And they were going to talk and discuss some important ideas. We're going to start with hearing from these two amazing sisters. Michelle Alexander, who you heard, wrote this book that has revolutionized people's understanding of what's happening with prisons.
That's right. Yes, yes, yes.
I sometimes wonder what the NAACP and the Congressional Black Caucus do with that book. And the other amazing sister that you just heard of, Angela Davis, who is whose contributions are legendary, who talked about mass incarceration more than a decade ago, who wrote the book about Are Prisons Obsolete, which I read parts of it in a prison one time, and they put in lockdown the brother who had sponsored my visit. That book is so profound that only now are people beginning to understand it. And she, of course, founded Critical Resistance. And I just want to tell a small story that I ran into Skip Gates once in an airport after he had been arrested by the cops in Boston. And he said to me, that experience made me think that maybe Angela was not crazy. So these 2 wild women, I call them wild sisters, will now address the first question that we're going to pose to them, which is, what is the problem of mass incarceration? If it's true that a society can be judged by its prisons, what does the U.S. prison system say about the U.S. society? Michelle,
you go
start?
first. You go first, Angela. You take it away.
All right, go ahead, Angela.
Well, since I've been allowed to speak. Is this working? No, I guess I'll have to hold it up. Or maybe, let me use this. Okay. First of all, good evening, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be in New York again. And I think the last time I was here at St. John the Divine, we also had a call from Mumia. So this is really a wonderful and moving experience. Now, I know we don't have very much time to respond to the questions since we have this wonderful, illustrious panel, and it's an honor to share the stage with all of you. Mass incarceration. Perhaps I'll begin by saying that many, many years ago, over 40 years ago, when I was in jail myself for being involved in campaigns to free political prisoners, George Jackson, the Soledad Brothers, the members of the Black Panther Party, Lolita LeBron and the Puerto Rican Nationalists, Los Siete de la Raza. Many of us began to realize that it was not simply a question of political repression, but it was not simply a question of political repression directed against specific individuals, but the entire institution of the prison was an institution of repression. fueled by racism. And therefore, while we called for the freedom of political prisoners, we began to recognize that we had to challenge the institutionalization of racism and violence through the prison system. Now, as I think Asha said earlier, at that time, there was something like 200,000 people in prison. And I can remember very distinctly feeling that this was such a huge mass of people. We could have talked about mass incarceration then, and there were 200,000 people behind bars. And incidentally, there are currently about 200,000 people in prison in India, which is about to be the most populous country in the world, and people are talking about mass incarceration in India. So that when we speak about 2.5 million people in the country's jails and prisons, we know we have a serious issue. Now, let me move on very quickly to say, I just want to make a couple of points here. I think the development of this phenomenon we've come to call the prison industrial complex has a great deal to do with global capitalism, has a great deal to do with the rise of globalization in the 1980s. This is the period when you begin to see institutions that address issues of social services. You begin to see education deteriorating. You begin to see the whole welfare system falling apart. And as a matter of fact, only that which is profitable begins to matter. Not people, but profits. And therefore, people who have problems of a lack of education, a lack of housing, no jobs, and so forth, begin to be treated as superfluous, as not belonging to this new globalization-inspired economy. And therefore, you put them in prison, and in the process, you get rid of the problems they supposedly have. You hide the problems of poverty by incarcerating people. And in the process, of course, you create another profitable enterprise. You create a profitable prison industrial complex. Now, let me just say very briefly that we know that this whole process is fueled by racism. And I'm sure that Michelle's going to talk about the part played by racism in producing this phenomenon of mass incarceration. I also think it's important to point out that one of the fastest growing sectors of the prison complex is the immigrant detention facility.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
And perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about this later on, but we should be aware of the fact that the U.S. has provided the model for the uses of incarceration all over the world. The prison has become a marketable commodity that is devouring the lives of people, especially in the global South, but literally all over the world. And finally, it's not only a question of considering the impact of mass incarceration on people who are in prison, but the uses of carceral technologies on people in the so-called free world. And the best example one can see of that is in occupied Palestine, and the role that Israel plays, funded by the U.S., in producing what you can call the largest open-air prison in the world. Thank you.
Well, it's almost enough said. I have to say, that I first heard Angela speak about the emergence of this prison industrial complex decades ago, when I myself was still quite asleep to what was happening around me. I was in law school at the time, and I went to hear Angela speak at a high school in Monterey, California, in a gymnasium that was packed. And at the time, I was aspiring to be a public defender, and I thought, as I was graduating from law school, that I knew quite a bit about the criminal justice system. I had interned in a public defender office, and I thought I knew what was going on. And I heard Angela speak about there being writing on the wall of what was to come, and that if we continue the rate of incarceration, that we could have millions of people behind bars. And I remember shaking my head and thinking, millions? I know the system is bad, but... And then I went on and worked in public defender offices, worked as a civil rights attorney, working in communities hard hit by mass incarceration. And it took a series of experiences for the light bulb to finally go on for me. And like Skip Gates, I realized Angela was right. Our system of mass incarceration is truly the most pressing racial justice issue of our time. It is the vehicle through which it's the vehicle through which the clock on racial progress has literally been turned back. It is the retaliation against communities of color for the progress gained in the civil rights movement and in the Black Power movement. It is a backlash that we are experiencing, a political backlash that gained in steam at precisely the moment that the changes in global capitalism were wreaking havoc on inner city communities nationwide. As the Reagan Revolution gained steam, urban areas across America were experiencing sudden, drastic joblessness. Jobs just vanished from these communities. Factories closed down, moved overseas. Technological innovations rendered hundreds of thousands of people now useless in this new global economy. And we had a choice in that moment about how to respond to hundreds of thousands of people locked in segregated communities, people who had depended on factory jobs for their survival. We had a choice in that moment about how to respond. We could continue down the road that so many freedom fighters and racial justice advocates had been traveling, a road towards inclusion and justice. We could go down that road, or we could go down another road, a road more familiar when it comes to matters of race, the road of exclusion, punitiveness, oppression, and despair. And we chose the latter road. Mass incarceration is not only payback for the civil rights movement, but it reflects a fundamental choice that has been made about how we as a nation will define ourselves in this era of global capitalism. Who the winners and losers will be, how they will be defined, and how those at the bottom will be dealt with, and the message it will send to the rest of us. So when people ask me why I believe that mass incarceration is the most pressing racial justice issue of our time, I say there is no path to racial justice that includes this system of control. No path. So if we are going to work for racial justice, we must work to end mass incarceration. Now, what does that mean? In my view, that doesn't mean just closing prisons, although that is a big part of it, and we must begin with Attica. We also have to recognize that the system of mass incarceration isn't just about who's in jail or who's in prison, but it's about all those on the outside who are doing time on the outside, who are on probation and on parole, people who are saddled with felony records and must check the box for the rest of their lives. People who are denied housing, access to basic public benefits, denied access to education because they've been branded a felon, branded a criminal. It is this entire caste-like system that's been created that must be undone. Today, of the 7.5 million people who are under correctional control today, less than 2 million of those people are actually in prison. All the rest of them are on jail or probation or on parole, firmly within the grip of this system, but not physically behind prison walls. So when we talk about ending mass incarceration, I hope we commit ourselves to dismantling this entire caste-like system and build a movement on behalf of those who are doing time on the inside as well as those on the outside. You guys are amazing.
And we have just begun. So now we're going to ask all 5 speakers to address. They all are very active and they travel, and we're going to ask them all to address what they see in terms of developing movement around the country. And I'm going to start with my brother Jazz Hayden, who is an example of what Michelle was just talking about. Jazz spent time in prison. He came out and turned his life completely around, has phenomenal accomplishments. I don't have time to go into them. And has also totally focused on serving the community. The way he serves the community is to show people how they have to stand up to the kind of attacks the police make on the black community in particular, black and brown communities. And you've got to see the videos, if you haven't seen him in action, of how he stops stop and frisk by watching, filming what the police is doing, asking questions non-stop, challenging them, saying, why are you doing this? Are these people really criminals? Are they the terrorists? Are you doing this just for... I can't even... Every time I see him, it is powerful. And the police know how powerful it is, and they hate him for it. And the system hates him for it. It's not just the police, the people who are in charge of the police. And so what they've done, they're trying to silence him. On a bogus, totally bogus charge, they arrested him, and now there's a grand jury that's trying to send him to prison for up somewhere between 2 to 14 years. And of course, we're going to stop it, right? We're going to stop it. And so I want to start. We're going to ask all 5 panelists to answer this question about what they see happening. But I'm going to start with Jazz because he's right in the middle of it, right here in New York City. Jazz.
All right.
Before I forget, there's going to be collection outside for Jazz's legal defense, and I urge you to contribute to that. There'll be 2 buckets in the back when you leave.
Woo. What do I see in the streets of Harlem? What do I see in Alabama? What do I see in California? What do I see in Chicago, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey? And is Atlantic City in the house? You got here too late. You missed the VIP seats. Now, all over this country, everywhere I've been, and I've traveled around this country extensively, and especially in the last year, I've been out to the West Coast, to Alabama, and to LA, meeting with a group of individuals who have formed an organization which I'm a part of called the Formerly Incarcerated and Convicted People's Movement. These are all former prisoners that have experienced the criminal injustice system. And let me tell you why I say injustice system, because there's 2 systems that exist in this country. One is criminal justice, and the other is criminal injustice. And the criminal injustice system consists of arrest, jail, prison, parole, back to jail, back to prison, and it's an endless cycle. The criminal justice system that exists in this country here is the one that is primarily reserved for white people, for people middle class and upper class. And that system consists of probation, fines, restitution, house arrest, and non-incarceration. And those are the penalties that they give out in that system. That's the system that we want. This other system that exists is the one that everybody around this country, movement is beginning to percolate everywhere. And we see it right here in this room. 5, 10 years ago, this couldn't have happened. But suddenly people are beginning to wake up. And everywhere we look, we see movement building, right? And we're moving towards that critical point in this struggle where we're going to have to begin to start talking about community and start talking about connecting the dots. And that's what's happening all over this country. All of us in this room here, we need not come in here and then walk out unconnected. We need to connect, and that's what's happening around this country.
You're next, my brother.
First, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to really give extra love to Pam Africa and Suzanne Ross for making this happen. I mean, really, this started off as a phone conversation with me and Pam, and me and Suzanne, and then Suzanne and Pam. We said we were going to have a little book party for the Mumia book, and we said we are going to try and see if we could get a little room in Riverside, and we hope enough people will come to fill up that little room. And that conversation and that idea has expanded to what you see in this room, and 99.9% of it has to do with the work of Suzanne and Pam and Sophia and all the people who really struggled to make this happen. It's a testimony to what's possible when we come together. So just give them some love, please.
Naomi,
oh, Sister Naomi. Oh, no, absolutely, Naomi. Absolutely. Absolutely. All those people on those conference calls I kept being late for, But, right. I was being nice. But when I think about what's been said and when I think about the question of what work I see being done and what's not being done, I'm actually inspired and motivated. Like Jazz said, what was possible 10 years ago was much more limited in scope than what's possible now. And I think a big reason why there are so many more possibilities now is because there's a bigger gap between those who are privileged and comforted, and in comfort rather, than those who don't. When I look at Doc's last book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, he begins to talk about that growing gap between the have-nots and the have-gots that's expressed through all sorts of social misery for black folk, for brown folk, for poor folk. I mean, it's getting more and more vast, the gap between those two extremes. And so I think that's part of why you see the response on the ground all around the country and really all around the world that you're beginning to see. So as I travel the country, I see all sorts of pieces that speak to the prison crisis. I agree with Michelle that the mass incarceration crisis is the biggest thing that we're facing as a nation, as a global community. The question, though, is how do we respond to it? For me, what I'm seeing right now is in different pockets, in different areas of political work, in different communities, in different areas, I see people doing work that is directly connected to the prison industrial complex struggle, directly connected to the resistance against mass incarceration. I think the challenge, though, is for us to connect the dots. So you look in New York or Philadelphia or New Orleans or Baltimore, you look around, you see mass education reform, just to give you an example. And you see people on the ground struggling not just to get better schools and to have their kids do better on high-stakes standardized tests, but people are beginning to see the direct connection between these first-class jails and these second-class schools. People see the connection. You can't miss it, right? People see the direct connection between black and brown people who become criminalized at a very early age the moment they walk into school. You go to Harlem, you go to East New York, you go to Queens, you go to the Bronx, you see a line down the street of people trying to get into these schools, right? And the reason the line is so long is because they're being searched, they're being checked, there's surveillance cameras, more surveillance equipment has been used in schools than prisons over the last 5 years. So you begin to see the infrastructure of prison. You see police officers, probation officers, parole officers. You begin to see dogs sniffing at our kids. You begin to see random locker searches, fingerprint scans, body scans. You begin to see this entire infrastructure of prison. And so it takes you 20 minutes to get into school. Once you get in, ain't nobody stopping you from leaving, right? The entire infrastructure is about controlling and preparing and disciplining our bodies for life in prison more so than it is for anything possibly educational. So we're beginning to see that. All right. People on the ground are beginning to see how our children are being criminalized at an early age. They're beginning to see the relationship also between the lack of access to education, the lack of access to early literacy, and incarceration. If you can't read at 8, there's a really good chance you could be incarcerated at 18. That's the logic of the day, and that's what we're beginning to see. And so I see a lot of work in that area. Another area that I see work being done is mental health. You know, I think you said this, Angela, 10, 20 years ago, you said one of the greatest crises of the 21st century, one of the biggest challenges of the black community for the 21st century will be one of mental health. And I think that we can't understate how important mental health is to our community, but we also can't understate the connection. It's important, the connection between mental health and mass incarceration, because what we've seen over the last 30 years is not just incarceration, but transcarceration. We have seen people move from one form of institution to another. In the 1980s, 1970s, we had some form, not great, but some form of mental health facility for people struggling with mental health. And just to set the taboos aside, we all got struggles with mental health. Ain't no way you could be black or brown or poor in America and not have some struggles with mental health. That's just the reality of it. And white folk too, for the very same reason. It's something crazy making about privilege too. You know what I mean? So, but what happened over those 30 years is that we saw a divestment from mental health resources, a divestment from preparing people or treating people through mental health, right? So we moved from a medicalized state to a criminalized state, to the penal state. Right? And so those very same people under the Reagan administration, at the same time that we were beginning to prosecute a war on drugs, we were taking money out of mental health. Those people who were in mental facilities go to the street. And then we criminalize being on the street through a range of public policies on a state level, like criminalizing homelessness, criminalizing loitering, public drunkenness, public urination. We did all this stuff that might on its face seem intuitively okay, but what it ended up with is people who should be in mental health facilities on the ground. And then they're on the ground and they have greater access to drugs. And then we criminalize the medical addiction of drugs. And then after you criminalize the medical addiction of drugs, you have people with mental health trouble with the medical addiction to drugs now incarcerated, subjected to greater trauma, greater abuse, dislocation, isolation, marginalization, and no access to anything else. Then they get out of jail. They still don't have access to housing. And so at this point, prison has actually become the only sustainable form of public housing that the government has invested in the last 30 years. I mean, you see what I'm saying? I'm going to take my seat in a minute. You know, we're in the church, y'all.
Take your time, brother.
You know, when the preacher says, you know what's about to happen.
Take your time.
Nah, but I'm about to pass this thing. But the point here is, at the end of the day, at the point they leave prison, they then enter the zone that Michelle talks about so marvelously in the new Jim Crow. So I see people working on mental health, and I see people working in education, and then I see people reacting to Troy Davis, reacting to Trayvon Martin, reacting to Shaquanda Cotton, reacting to Janala Wilson. We could go around the country and see all the reactions. We see the reaction to Mumia Abu-Jamal. We see the reaction to all the political prisoners around the country. And in each pocket, we're talking about the death penalty. We're talking about torture. We're talking about isolated housing. We're talking about these things. But what we have to do is connect the dots, connect the education movement and the radical educational left movement to the mental health movement. Connect that to the movement against the death penalty. Connect that to the movement against isolated housing, because that's what's not happening right now. And when we connect those dots and we organize and we galvanize and we mobilize, we end up with a strong movement, not to reform, but to what? Prison abolition. Thank you.
Oh, okay, yes. Sister Susan, thank you so very much. What a blessing to be here. Let's thank Sister Susan, Sister Pam, Sister Naomi, and the others. Give them another hand. Give them another hand. This is a magnificent moment. When you have this kind of moment, we're not on calendar time tonight. This is the time of the Spirit, because this is consecrated time and the struggle of so many people trying to keep alive a tradition. Brother Jazz, exemplary freedom fighter. Sister Angela, living legend because of her deep love for poor people, the wretched of the earth. Our dear Sister Michelle has written the secular Bible of the movement, not just against mass incarceration, not just about new Jim Crow, but to cast a light on the new form that the legacy of white supremacy takes in our time. So we're willing to talk openly, candidly, critically, and lovingly about a people who have been traumatized and terrorized and stigmatized for over 400 years. And this young brother representing voices of a younger generation, many of whom have opted for career rather than calling, have opted for ambition rather than fundamental transformation, have opted for being peacocks rather than eagles, concerned with the least of these. Now, I've been blessed with Brother Tavis Smiley. I'm on a poverty tour, number 2. We've done 12 events. I just was in 4 cities today. So if my voice goes out, my effort is strong, but my body's giving up because I'm a Jesus-loving, free black man who's been in America for 59 years, and sometimes your body just gives out on you. Sometimes you just give out. That's all right. I just sit down and listen to Luther, God dang it. But what do I see? Very briefly, traveling the nation, I see precious human beings of all colors, cultures, sexual orientations, who are living in an empire in relative economic decline because of corporate greed and big banks and big corporations who have been generating billions of dollars with no productive value, no concern about public interest and common good. I see working people being pushed to the edge, and I see poor people being rendered invisible. I see deep cultural decay because I see an obsession with stimulation and titillation and weapons of mass distraction that keeps people sleepwalking and keeps people complacent, keeps people complicit, and keeps people cowardly not wanting to tell the truth about the country in which we live. And I see political paralysis of 2 political parties that are tied to Wall Street and big corporations. Though there are some differences, they are in denial about the fundamental issues facing the empire. And let us be honest about it. Anytime you talk about the crimes in America, and anytime you talk about the mass incarceration and the resistance against mass incarceration, it takes us back to the initial crimes of white supremacist mistreatment of our precious indigenous brothers and sisters. They don't have to be in the room for us to acknowledge the role that they had to go through in order for America to become America. And then the second sin, which is the enslavement of Africans. And it has been the black freedom movements and the anti-racist movements that has reminded America when America was about to go under that you either renew your democratic possibilities or you become another nation, crypto-fascist, authoritarian, autocratic, patriarchal, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, shaped with xenophobia. So when we talk about hyper-incarceration, we're talking about the ways in which our precious young people, disproportionately black and brown, who could have used their energies to be part of a movement, a freedom movement, a black freedom movement. When I say black freedom movement, I'm talking about justice and freedom. Don't believe the hype that the black freedom movement has been solely about the freedom of black people. That's not true. Frederick Douglass didn't believe it. Martin didn't believe it. Ella didn't believe it. They began on the chocolate side of town, but it spilled over to vanilla folk, spilled over to yellow folk, spilled over to brown folk. But you're going to have to start with the legacy of white supremacy if you're going to really transform this system. That's why when our dear sister said New Jim Crow, that's why when Sister Angela said when I'm talking about abolishing prisons, it's part of an anti-white supremacist movement. And people have been so in denial, and in the age of Obama, it's difficult to be honest about how vicious this system, the white supremacist legacy really is with our precious black brother in the White House. Because it constitutes progress only to the degree to which we're less racist than we used to be, but we're more racist in institution when it comes to black poor, brown poor, when it comes to the possibilities of those who could constitute our movement. And so this movement begins with mass incarceration, but in the end, it's about the fundamental transformation of an empire that has democratic possibilities if we have the courage to fight for it and execute it. And if not, we slide down a slippery slope to hatred, revenge, domination, and subordination. That's why I got a smile on my face, because that's the kind of people I want to be with.
Yes, sir.
Since Cornell is on a roll, we won't stop him and pick up right with the next question directly to Cornell again. So you just from a poverty tour, and you're doing these poverty tours. How have you seen, and how do people see, the relationship between mass incarceration and poverty, and how can we raise people's consciousness about that?
Well, I think it's part of the magnificent wave of fight back. We've been in 8 different cities, and we're leaving tomorrow morning, 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, to be down in Florida. But the fight back that's taking place, and the connection between the military-industrial complex on the one hand, the escalation of class struggle like Chicago this very moment, with the strike that's taking place, with our teachers who are being devalued, standing up in the face of not just the mayor, but the elite forces. We connected to the women wrestling with patriarchy and domestic violence. We connected to the precious children. And we've seen more and more an attempt to connect the dots in the tour that we have had. And that's also profoundly inspiring. Profoundly inspiring. When we travel, we're telling different folk, they're particular. I see my brother there in Occupy the Hood. They're good to see you, my brother. We tell folk over and over again, we've somehow got to be able to coalesce, not because we agree about everything, not because we have unanimity. I'm not giving up Jesus for nothing. That's all right. I could be wrong as 2 left shoes, but I'd take a bullet for the folk up here because they got the same kind of love that we're talking about. That's the context that we need to connect. Struggle against mass incarceration, the class struggle going on, women, poor children, and the anti-imperialist struggle. This is why Carl Dix, this is why the Black Agenda Report with Glenn Ford and Nellie Bailey, very important. The drones that dropped the bombs on innocent people in the Middle East is tied to the prison industrial complex here, tied to the Wall Street oligarch complex, tied to the corporate media complex, and tied to the market-driven privatizing efforts in education. And if we can't make that link together and keep love at the center of it, it's not a movement about hatred and revenge. It's about love and justice. And we all come at it in our own various ways, but we're sisters and brothers in this struggle together. That's what we're experiencing. That's why I'm fired up.
The next question is directed to Angela, and it's something that she is so knowledgeable about, which is the relationship, actually the whole issue of political prisoners, which the United States denies it has, but we of course know that there are hundreds of political prisoners in this country from all eras and all kinds of struggles. And the question we're raising tonight is, how do you see the potential relationship between the movement to free our heroes of the 60s and 70s to the present and the movement to end mass incarceration?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I know there's been some tension over the years between movements around specific political prisoners and movements that attempt to address the the larger question of the prison industrial complex. There are those who argue that movements around political prisoners individualize and personalize the struggle. I can say that when I was in jail over 40 years ago, I confronted that very question myself, because here was a movement that was developing all over the country, all over the world, Free Angela, right? And thanks to that movement, I'm here today. But I was intensely aware of the fact that I was one of many political prisoners, one of many prisoners. So why is it that people who stood up for me would not also stand up for Erica Huggins, would not also stand up for Bobby Seale, for example? And so I can remember meeting with people who were involved in what was then called the National United Committee to Free Angela Davis, and Charlene Mitchell, who was the head of that movement, is in the house. And I said we should change the name. It should be Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. But then also, we can't simply talk about specific individuals who are in prison because of their political beliefs or affiliations. We have to address the larger questions. And it is largely thanks to the work of prison intellectuals like George Jackson and many others that we were eventually able to develop a sense of the importance of addressing mass incarceration. We're here today to talk about closing down Attica. In 1971, when brothers at Attica stood up, they addressed all of the issues that were facing people who were prisoners all over the country and in many parts of the world as well. And what they created was the possibilities for a new consciousness. Now, I think that in many ways we've resolved some of those tensions, but we still have to, as Cornell and Michelle and Mark and Jazz and everyone else has been pointing out, we have to be aware of the interconnections. In other words, we need a feminist approach to the issue of political prisoners and the prison industrial complex, which means that we recognize that as we focus on specific individuals, specific issues, we do it against the backdrop of an understanding of the interrelatedness and intersectionality of a whole range of issues. Now, many of them have been mentioned, and you talked about mental health, I think, which is really important, Mark. But what about food? What is the relationship between food politics and the food that is destroying us, and especially destroying Black communities, and the use of systems of incarceration to devour all of the potential of our communities? What is the relationship between, as I was saying before, the struggle to free Palestine and the struggle to abolish imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment? We have to begin to think in capacious terms. We have to begin to think in more complex terms. And in response to the second question, which I don't think I was able to speak to, I think what's really exciting is that sense that young people who are involved in this campaign are bringing to the movement, that sense of understanding the interconnectedness of racism and war and imprisonment and militarism and homophobia and transphobia, all of these questions. And finally, I think that the struggle against mass incarceration is really a struggle against capitalism. And thanks to recent movements, we can now speak openly about capitalism. We can talk about the damage that capitalism does. We can talk about the way it insinuates itself into our lives and into our dreams and how it destroys human potential. And so there's one other question I think that needs to be added to this conversation, and that is, well, what kind of society do we want? If we want a society in which prisons no longer serve as the dominant mode of punishment, if we want a society that is not based on retributive justice, what kind of society do we want? What is it going to look like? And so we have to begin to use our imagination. And, well, I've been a socialist and a communist for the vast majority of my life. So I would like to think us imagine anew, what would a socialist society look like today? And I think that is a charge that the movement against mass incarceration, the abolitionist movement, has to take up. And not only how do we imagine a new world, but how do we imagine our emotions transform? How do we imagine ourselves as different human beings who do not require vengeance and retribution and violence and war? This is what I think the movement is all about. And I kind of went far afield of the question, but I think that political prisoners have given us the lead in helping to envision this new framework within which to talk about mass incarceration.
Thank you very much, Angela. I just want to say that for those who may be new to the movement and who may not have heard this conception in the past, what we usually mean by talking about political prisoners are people who went to prison specifically for their political beliefs and actions. Just to add that little clarification. A lot of people know that, but I wanted to make sure that it was mentioned. The next question is one that challenges many, many movements and is not unique to this one, which is, how do we deal with the relationship between short-term gains, goals, even like the one of closing Attica down? I mean, we know that's not the ultimate goal of what we're talking about. But how do we deal with the relationship between short-term goals and a long-term strategy to achieve what we want to achieve? How do we avoid having short-term campaigns and goals lead to potential setbacks or to limitation of achieving what we want to achieve, versus using short-term goals and campaigns to move our movement forward? So I'm going to ask Michelle to address that, and Mark and Jazz. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's an excellent question. And as someone who used to be an expert in pursuing short-term reformist goals, I know the difference between doing reform work and work that's truly transformational. When I was at the ACLU directing the Racial Justice Project in California, we worked around the clock. We were dedicated, didn't get a lot of sleep, working around the clock, pursuing what were ultimately very short-term reformist goals. And they were the goals we thought were achievable within the current political moment. And we invested a lot of time and energy trying to win these short-term reformist gains, only to see those wins unraveled in the next election cycle or undermined by another court decision, and we would be back at square one or perhaps a little bit further back, or we would be ahead, but whatever gain we had made had created the illusion of much greater progress than we had actually achieved, and much of the momentum and organizing effort that had gone into it was dissipated by the illusion of more progress than had actually been achieved. So when you say, you know, how can we do short-term work and still achieve our long-term goals, I think we have to do our short-term work in a way that is truly revolutionary. And it's not so much what particular goals you choose. I mean, I've been traveling around talking to a lot of audiences, and people will say, well, what's the most important thing that needs to be changed right now? What's the number one priority? And I'll say, actually, talk to the people in your community and pick the issue that feels most pressing to you and those who are most affected by the system right now. And it doesn't matter so much what it is. It's the way you do this work, rather than the particular goal that you choose, that has the potential to be truly transformative. So if in your community or your church or place of worship or in your school you decide felon disenfranchisement is the issue you're fired up about, well, go all out and work for felon disenfranchisement. But be sure that in everything that you say and everything that you do in your work, you make absolutely clear that your goal isn't simply to win back the vote so that people can vote within the political system as currently structured, but that your goal is to unravel a caste-like system that operates to lock people in a permanent second-class status and is sustained by an economic system that's immoral. So in all that we say about what we're doing, we have the potential to turn short-term goals into truly revolutionary, transformative work. And that's true if you're working to, abolish laws prohibiting marijuana. It's true if you're working to, end the federal laws that prohibited people from getting food stamps if they have drug offenses. It's true if you're seeking the end or the closing of Attica Prison. Whatever we do, we have to make clear and not be afraid of defining what our ultimate goal is in a way that's truly revolutionary and challenges the public to imagine that, as Angela put it, another kind of world truly is possible. But if we find ourselves tempted, as I was when I was at the ACLU, to read the polling data and make decisions about what to say based on what people hear, or if we find ourselves tempted to take the shorter, easier route and lobby people behind closed doors rather than having a public fight in the streets, if we find ourselves tempted to do that, then we know we're on the path of reform work that is headed nowhere. But if we have chosen our goal and worked for it and been willing to go to the streets and define what we're up to in a truly radical and revolutionary way, then the ultimate goal that we seek in any individual moment or community matters much less. And the last thing I'll say is that try to make the work that you're doing contagious. Try to make the work you're doing something that can be replicated elsewhere, so that when people say, oh, they're calling for the Attica prison to be closed, maybe there's a prison in our state, in our community, that we should define as the first one to go. Find ways to make the work contagious so it can set a fire that spreads across America. Jazz?
Yeah. Michelle Alexander wrote a great book. In that book, she described the problem. What we need to be talking about now is the solution. And in order to talk about the solution, we're going to have to take control of this whole narrative about justice and about what's fair and all this poppycock, man, that they put in our heads from the time that we were in kindergarten. About this and all this talk about this being an exceptional nation. You know, we have to change this narrative. We have to take control of this narrative. We can't, as long as we continue to talk using their language and their definitions of what reality is, we're lost. The question becomes for us now, in terms of solutions, is how do we get rid of all of these things that divide us, all of these disconnects? We have so many different views of what it is that should be done, but what we lack, I think, is a common vision. And the Bible says, without vision, the people perish. We don't have a common vision. For the last 40 years in New York State and probably around the country, we have had what a friend of mine calls boutique activism. Boutique activism is when everybody picks out a piece of the problem and focuses on that part of the problem. It could be 100 people working on drug policy, and the only ones they talk to are the funders. They don't talk to one another. They don't talk to one another. There's no horizontal integration. Only thing they're concerned about is where the funding is coming from. Now, those of us that have been out here and worked with these organizations, if you go around and ask these organizations what are the one thing that they've done to improve the conditions of the people that they're working for and the communities that they're working for the most part, you're going to get silence. You're going to get silence. And I'm not knocking these organizations, you know, because movement and the consciousness it takes to build movement is a process, right? We try reform, but we've tried it for 40 years and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The prison population went from, in 1970, from 300,000 to 2.4 million today. The largest prison population in the history of humankind. And they say if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. Right? So we need to change, and we need fundamental change. Now listen, as Cornell said, you know, we don't agree on everything. I've been to prison since I was 16 years old. I've been in state prison, I've been in federal prison, and I was born in Harlem Hospital. You know, so I was born into a prison. You know. So when I talk about prison, I'm not talking about something from an academic perspective. I'm talking about, man, I experienced this. You understand? Solitary confinement, I experienced that. Right? Denial of the right to vote and being treated like a piece of garbage, I've experienced that, man. And so I was in Attica, but the year before Attica went up, and we organized, and we came together. There was everything, everybody in there. I mean, every movement that was taking place in the streets, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the Weathermen, the SDS, all of them were in there. And as we began to educate and organize ourselves, we realized, man, that we had to get rid of that whole alphabet soup of Black Panthers, BLA, Young Lords, Weathermen, SDS. And we got rid of all those labels, and we came together as one, and we called ourselves the People's Party. The People's Party. And that's what you saw when Attica went up. That's what you saw in that yard. Fortunately, I was shipped out of there 6 days before the place went up. But the preparation that went into building the solidarity that we had took place for a year before that, man. You know, it took place. It came out of the tombs. You know, when the tombs went up in smoke. And they moved us all to Attica. But now out there on the West Coast, they doing the same thing. They eliminating all those labels. White, black, Latino, Asian, Indian. And they've agreed to eliminate them so that they can begin to speak in one voice, just like the people that have them in them cages. They speak in one voice. All the people in power during Attica Rebellion, they spoke in one voice, right? And they met prisoners that spoke in one voice. Why is it that we don't seem to learn that lesson, man? Why is it we continue to see ourselves as the only right way? Why can't we connect the dots? We talk about prison, man. Like I say, I've been in prison. The only thing a prisoner wants is out. He don't want no flat screen TVs in the visiting room. He don't want no, children playpens. He wants out. He wants to go to his family. Huh? He wants out. That's what prisoners want. So everybody that's working on issues of reform and trying to make the prison a better place to live, listen, that's not what prisoners want, right? And this whole issue that these false dichotomies that we keep engaging in, man, children in prison, women in prison, old people in prison, they are human beings in cages. That's what they are. That's what they all have in common. They are human beings in cages, man. And this is what we got to start, we got to take control of this language, man. We got to take control of this narrative, man. We got to start eliminating the things that disconnect us, that divide us. Until we do that, until we begin to connect the dots, we are finished. We ain't going nowhere. The only movement we're going to have, in the words of my friend Jamal Joseph, is the bowel movement. Thank you.
I don't know what to say after that. Because so much has already been said that I was thinking, but I think for me, getting to your question, there's a tension there between trying to do short-term work and trying to establish long-term goals, particularly when the long-term goals are informed and undergirded by an ideology that we believe in, an investment that we have. That tension is really highlighted by what Jazz just said, because he's like, yo, I was there. This is real stuff. This is real life. These are real experiences. And so we can sit here and in an abstract way talk about an unrelenting commitment to revolution while people are living in a context where they could be comforted by reform. To be specific, it's easy for us ideologically to say, and I struggle with this every day, so I don't even have an answer to your question really as much as I can tell you it's a struggle for me, right? Because I sit here and say, well, healthcare reform in prison. Let me put it differently to be clear. The substance of the question, the implicit part of the question is, if we keep doing prison reform, we will convince the world that prisons can be reformed, that there's something salvageable about prison, right? That's the point, right? And so the challenge is, if we keep allowing reforms and fighting for reforms, and the world will say, okay, prison is bad, but it's fixable. This is not something it's like white supremacy. It's like whiteness, right? Really, it's an idea that needs to be destroyed. It can't really be repaired, right? When we think about capitalism, it's a system that's actually so fundamentally corrupt that it can't be repaired. It can't be just regulated. It actually needs to be uprooted, right? I mean, that's the problem. But we keep convincing ourselves through reform that something else is possible. But the problem is, it's not just an ideological tension. People's lives would be better with health care. Lives are better when we fight against prisoner abuse. People's lives are better when we protect them from HIV/AIDS. People's lives are better when we give them access to libraries, right? In prison. Now, I understand that you'd rather be out than have a library. I'm with you, right? Yeah, right. But a library don't hurt. So the question is, at what level do we decide between yielding to particular reforms for the benefit of making people's lives better and more livable, And to what extent do we have to hold on to a broader principle of prison abolition, say this prison as such cannot work? For me, it's not either or, it's both and. And I think that speaks to the sort of pedagogical dimension of this. There's something that comes down to really sort of the lessons and the teaching that happen through our activism and through our work. And I mean that in two ways. One, our activism tells the world what's important. The causes that we choose and the way we approach those causes gives the world an understanding of what's possible with prison reform, what's possible with prison abolition, what's possible with prisoners. So when we do this work, I think it has to come with prison education, the other type of pedagogy I'm talking about. In other words, we have to actively educate the public about prison. We have to actively educate the world about what's possible. Because, Frederick Jameson said it is easier for people to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine the end of capitalism, right? And that's an important thing. But I think it's equally true about prison. I think people can't imagine a world outside of prison. People can't imagine another world. So as we do this prison work, as we reach out to, I'll give you an example. About 3 months ago, I was working on with CeCe McDonald's on her case. She was a transgender, y'all know CeCe, right? Right, transgender black woman who's been put in a men's prison. There's a broader question about what it means for the state to determine and identify gender. There's a larger question about whether it constitutes torture to identify as woman and be placed in a men's prison, to be misgendered for an entire prison. There's a broader question, right? So, no, but while we're fighting that larger ideological question, while we're wrestling with some Foucaultian notion of discourse, CeCe's actually in prison subjected to abuse. So we have to find a way to deal with both of those things through our work, through our writing, through our activism. We have to be able to tell both stories, right? We have to be able to talk to the world about decarceration and what that means. We have to talk to the world about excarceration and what that means. Because the world, as you said, the world can't imagine the idea of responding to abuse or injustice through anything but punishment. And we can't imagine punishment outside of anything but containment. As Jazz talked about, putting people in cages. So for me, I'm constantly struggling with that tension and that contradiction. So for me, it's always about both and. If I can heal something and help something in a moment through a particular campaign for a particular person or a particular cause, I want to contribute to that. But at the same time, we have to educate the public that another world is indeed possible.
By the way, that kind of thinking that Marc just laid out is really typical of the book that he wrote with Mumia, which is very, very exciting to read, a dialogue between two very exciting thinkers of different generations. I strongly recommend it. That's not my job here tonight, but he reminded me of what he does in that book with Mumia, and it's quite an education. It's called The Classroom and the Cell, and The Classroom and the Cell, and it's between Marc Lamont Hill, a dialogue between him and Mumia. There are passages that are really funny, where their age difference and generation difference really shows up very dramatically, and the dialogue, and it's really what we need in this world, right? That intergenerational. And I give a shout out to Asha Bendelli, who edited that book. With pleasure. Okay, we're running out of time, and people are giving me signs about how many minutes are left. Do you want us to end? Okay, we're going to have our last question, though, okay? So the last question is, and I'm going to ask all the panelists, and I have not interrupted anybody once, right? So you will indulge my request that this is the last statement by each of you, not forever, but the last statement tonight. And I know they're not going to be shut up. None of them is going to be shut up. And the question is, what is your vision for the movement? What do you think is possible? And what do you think we should all be working on in this next stage? And if you can each do that in 2 minutes, we'd be eternally grateful. And so will security of this building and all the people who are responsible for closing it down on time. So I'm going to start this time with Angela. Poor Angela. And then we'll go to everybody else.
Well, I suppose I'll begin by saying we really need a movement. We really need a movement. We need a movement. And therefore, I think it is necessary to think beyond our often relatively small organizations and formations. We need to think about building a mass movement in which the vast majority of people in this country say no to mass incarceration, and eventually learn how to identify with prison abolition, penal abolition, and eventually revolution. And so that means that sometimes we have to be willing to give up our control over what people say and what people think. The greatest challenge, it seems to me, is to encourage people to think. Encourage people to think. And I'm actually less concerned about what they think than I am about how they think and how they begin to develop a critical awareness of the interconnectedness of all of the issues we have discussed. And I think that we need a movement in which people are encouraged to respect those who are responsible for these ideas, to respect all of the political prisoners who have done so much work, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, and I want to ask everyone in the audience to stand up who has been a political prisoner or a prisoner and who continues to work around these issues. Okay. And I think that one of the immediate goals of this movement is to encourage respect for those who have had the experience of dealing with the worst criminal justice system in this country and the model for what has become a global prison industrial complex. Thank you.
That was great. Can I ask you for 2 minutes, really? Everybody? Okay. Michelle.
Well, I have a dream. I've been traveling around speaking all over the country in prisons, reentry centers, high schools, universities, churches, places of worship. And everywhere I go, I see people who are eager to take action, eager to build this movement, eager to help wake people up in their communities, in their circles of concern, eager to be part of this movement, and then they say, I don't know what to do. I don't want to join the NAACP. I don't have an organization to join. I don't feel like just writing my congressman. What do I do? What do I do? How can I be part of this movement? And I have a dream that within the next couple of years, we will find a way to ensure that everyone in every community, no matter where they live, has a way of becoming directly involved in this movement, no matter where they are. And I think we need to get creative, because a lot of people, the first thing they do is try to write a grant proposal and get some funding and try to start an organization, and they find out nobody wants to give you money for that. So I think we need to get creative. We live in the age of the internet. We live in an age where we can form networks without a whole lot of money and infrastructure, and we have got to find a way of developing structures for channeling the enormous amount of energy, enthusiasm, and commitment that exists in communities all around this country today. And so that is my dream, that within the next couple of years, we find a way to ensure that every person, no matter where they are, can join this movement in a meaningful way, and that maybe that means that all people of conscience who care about ending mass incarceration find a way to come together in some kind of national convening and develop a platform that begins something like "We, the people of these United States," in an effort to create a way more perfect union, agree to a few simple items of a platform that forms some kind of loose organization that people can become part of, stay connected with, can join a movement that feels contagious and that is not in competition with other organizations in their community, but helps to support the great work that is going on. We have a moment right now, a moment in our history where for the first time in 40 years, people across the political spectrum are actually open to having a conversation about our prison system and the system of mass incarceration. If we let this moment pass, without finding a way to channel this energy and allow people who are committed to get involved, I think we will find ourselves 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road saying, I wish we could build a movement, but we can right now. The energy is out there. It's just about putting our heads together and finding out a way to channel it with the tools we have available to us. And there's no moment like the present, so let's get busy.
Oh, absolutely. I would just like to go back to the voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal and talking about the movement. Not just what he said, which is profound, but how he said it. Because if you listen close to his voice, you could hear Bessie Smith, you could hear Louis Armstrong, you could hear Curtis Mayfield, you could hear Nina Simone. I'm talking about a revolutionary love that allows you to take a stand and sustain your struggle in the face of whatever the world has to give you, and you still have a smile and style and a deep sense of compassion. There's a militant tenderness in his voice. How many of us have the tenderness in his voice? And we never been on death row. Why? Because there's something in his spirit, in his tradition, that allows him to sustain his revolutionary commitment for so long. But that love and that tenderness reaches out to touch us like John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" touches your soul. Or the way Sarah Vaughan sings Stephen Sondheim's "Send in the Clowns." We talking about spirit, y'all. We talking about culture. We talking about commitment. We talking about character. We talking about integrity. We talking about magnanimity. We talking about what it means to be great in human body, in time and space for the little time you're here. Revolutionary love, militant tenderness, but also a subversive sweetness. Did you hear the sweetness in Mumia Abu-Jamal's voice? Now for some of us, that's the sweetness of our grandmothers too. That's the sweetness of our uncles too, who at their best looked at slavery and Jim Crow and homophobia and patriarchy and imperialism and said, you know what? Looks like we got the chance of a snowball in hell, but we're going to fight on anyway and reach out to anybody who's willing to fight on for something bigger than them. You can't have a movement without revolutionary love. You can't have it without militant tenderness. You can't have it without subversive sweetness and that imagination that Sister Angela was talking about.
If you guys don't mind, the two of you, I'm going to go on to the reading questions and call on the two of you to answer those, okay? So, we have obviously very limited time for questions, and we really apologize for that. We'd love to hear from you all, but we also wanted to hear from them, didn't we? So, I'm going to pose two questions to Marc and to Jazz, and others can comment briefly. So, and that's how we're going to end, before Asha will take a few questions on Twitter. Okay? So, one question I'm going to ask Marc, as the, I believe, youngest person on the panel. What is the student's place in the movement? What do you see in terms of building a student movement? Oh, sorry.
I think students are the movement, to be quite frank. I mean, you know, I'm at Columbia, and I see students who are organizing regarding Israel-Palestine. I see folk are organizing for workers' rights. I see people organizing against police brutality, white supremacy. When I was at Temple University, I mean, they unionized, they organized around everything from stop and frisk to what was the exploitation of graduate student labor. I mean, everything I see at the university level excites me. You know, everything I see with high school kids, when I look at what happened with Trayvon Martin, I mean, it was a different kind of movement. It was a different kind of resistance. But even seeing those young people offer the symbolic resistance of putting hoodies on, you know, and making their changing their Twitter avatar to picture on Twitter to wear a hoodie. I mean, that kind of symbolic resistance, if it gets organized and turned into something a little more concrete for me, I think that's powerful. There's never been a revolution, there's never been a movement in this country that hasn't been animated by young people. You know what I mean? Right. I mean, that's so critical. Right. And this movement is no different. We can't have a young anti-prison movement if young folk aren't at the center of it. And quite frankly, y'all are the primary targets of it. When you look at these civil injunctions against gangs in California, that's young folk. When you look at the curfews where they make it literally illegal to be young and outside in cities like Philadelphia and Los Angeles and Chicago and Detroit, that's targeted at y'all. This stuff is about y'all. You all need to organize. I'm in it too. I'm still claiming young status. I'm 33. We need to organize. Those of us in our 20s and close to it need to organize. Those teenagers need to organize and do this. The other thing you can never do, and this is so important, is you can never lose sight of the importance of these ideas. I mean, it's important to be activists, it's important to organize, but it's also important as you're in school to engage these ideas, to engage these books, to engage these thinkers, to engage these prison intellectuals. That's right. No, education is important, and that young brother right there is organizing for not at City College, but at the City University of New York to make sure that the CUNY system remains free, so that young people all around the city can access quality education. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. That's the work. That's the work that we have to do. As a kid, I was organized. I was radicalized rather by reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and probably even more importantly, the autobiography of Assata Shakur. Those two texts radically changed how I understood the world. That's why I'm here doing this work. I think the same thing is true for you all. Find those ideas. Read Angela Davis. Read Michelle Alexander. Read Cornell West. Read Mumia Abu-Jamal. Their voices, their vision, their ideas will change the world. But you all have to do that, read it, organize, and then hit the ground running. We cannot have a revolution on Facebook or Twitter. It's a good place to organize. No, I'm being real. I mean, there's something cool about Facebook and Twitter, and you all will have to find a way to use that new technology in a revolutionary fashion. It's a revolutionary form, but y'all got to provide the revolutionary content. But once you do that, I need you all to hit the ground and actually organize in the interest of freedom and justice. And if you do that, this prison thing will be nothing to change, because at every moment in history where something has changed, y'all have been at the center of it. And when we fought, we won. It's really that simple.
And the last questions I'm going to ask, but before I do that, I just want to say I love these panelists. I really love you all and how serious you are as activists and thinkers and participants, and the quality of love that you project, speaking of love, Cornell, is very profound, and hats off to all of you. But I also want to ask one more question, and that's about the future and our vision, again, our vision for the future. And I'm going to ask just two people to please speak at this point. And you have priority because you skip the last round, but anybody, one other person, which are people ask this a lot on all levels. What are the alternatives to prison and incarceration? Because people can't even imagine that a lot of times. So I'd like to address that briefly. Did you want to answer that, Jazz? Did you want to address that? Okay, and then one other person.
I belong to a group called Campaign to End New Jim Crow. Yeah. And I'm saying this now because I should have said it before. I want to make sure that I'm able to get home safely. Yeah. My comrades and allies and friends out there. We started with a book study group in Riverside Church Prison Ministry. And the book that we studied was Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And after we read that book, there was no way that we could just go back to sleep. That was a wake-up call. And since then, we put on several events here. And but after we finished the study group, the most important thing was we sat down and began to work on a vision and a mission statement. And out of that vision, we opted for abolition. You know, because during slavery, they wanted to reform slavery too. You know, you only had to be a slave for so many years, and then after that, then you were out. And you know, reform, we rejected that, and we opted for abolition. But we also opted for the abolition of prisons, but also the building of caring communities. And all the resources that go into this prison industrial complex, we want to take that money and put it into the communities that are most impacted. That's our vision, and that's our mission. There's two sides to that equation. We want to tear down, and we want to build up. And we're looking for anybody that sees that vision and can commit to it. This is what we want. Nothing less. Not reform. We don't want to tweak the system. But anybody that's doing anything to raise consciousness, whether it's reformers or whatever, we support you. We are there for you. But ultimate goal, our ultimate vision is abolition of prisons, man. Men created prisons, and men can dismantle them. You know, it's not like they're written in stone. You know, men created this capitalist system. We can change this. Men created this system of this dehumanizing system of criminal injustice, and we can change that also. So I want y'all to know that we are open. We're looking for everybody, anybody that can come to the table and bring something to the table. Fit in, you know, get in where you fit in. You know, whatever skill sets you have, man, we need it. And we want to connect with everybody else that's out there working, as long as they're working in the interest of the people and not in their own self-interest with hidden agendas and the rest of that. So we're reaching out, and the group we have now is pure at heart, man. You can't find a better group of people. You know, they come out, they do the work. There's no benefits to this except their commitment or being engaged in the struggle to change what is totally intolerable. We cannot allow this system to continue like it is, man. We can't allow these bums to come into our communities, man, and criminalize our youth, you know, and line them up to go to prisons. We can't allow these police in our schools, you know, putting our kids through the prison experience before they even get there. And most of all, we can't allow them to turn our communities into open air prisons, because that's what they've become, right? All right, so I just have one more thing to say. I love you, all of you.
I have to take back my offer to have one more person answer because we are running out of time, and we did want to answer some, at least one. So, hold on. Here comes Asha.
Thank you. I'm actually going to pass the up for us. And the last question we're going to ask is about what we say to those who are directly affected by the what do we say to wrap our arms in the spirit of love around these young brothers and sisters and people?
One of the problems of campaigns over the years and decades around prisoner rights and prison issues is that people tend to look down on those who are in prison. And so oftentimes the work, an amazing amount of work done on behalf of prisoners. Oftentimes that work has tended to replicate a kind of missionary approach. And so I think it's so important that we learn how to build egalitarian relationships with those who are behind walls. And it's so important to accept leadership from those who have had the experience of incarceration. And let me say that I think we also have to insist on understanding the way in which the incarceration of women sheds light on the whole system. So I don't want us to act as if it were only men who are suffering. Women constitute the fastest growing sector of the incarcerated population globally. And when we look at what happens to women in prison, when we look at what happens to transgender prisoners, we begin to see the work that the institution does to all people. We begin to see the role that it plays as a gendering apparatus. We begin to see the relationships between intimate violence and institutional violence, between what happens in the bedroom and what happens on the war field or in the streets. And so I think that what we say to prisoners is, we love you, we respect you, we accept your leadership.
Gotcha. To the middle.
To the middle. We don't go to the middle.